Okay, so how can you pre-fill data using JSON and Codable? Like, is it even possible? If I can beat this hot win challenge,
I'm dying.
anything is possible in life. And in this video, we'll be going over how to build on top of our last video where we were pre-filling data, but this time, see how we can read from a local JSON file and then store this data into SwiftData. So let's get this money. Now, the first thing we're actually going to need to do is actually create our JSON file. And if you have no idea what JSON means, it's fine. I actually do have a playlist on my channel that goes into like way more detail about, JSON and its purpose and all that kind of stuff. But we need a JSON file to basically, represent the model of our categories that we want to load by default. So in our project, in order to create a JSON file, it's quite simple. We just want to go to File New or Command N on your keyboard and then scroll down. And you should see there's an option here called empty. So we would just want this empty file so we can create any kind of file. So we hit next and we want to just call this category defaults dot JSON. So the dot JSON at the end is pretty important, right? So don't forget to do that and then hit save. So the whole purpose of this file, and let me just move this into the folder structure here. The whole purpose of this file is essentially just to basically represent the create categories. So these categories that we have here, we want to replace that with, our JSON. So we got a bit more of a structured file. So within here, I'm going to have to write some JSON and, I'll break it down as usual. So this is just a JSON representation of our create categories model. And if I actually get them up side by side, just so you can see them, you'll see that we actually have an array and then we have our object title, and then the value. So this basically is just representing this, but in JSON format. Now you might be wondering, okay, Tons, we're almost there. We're going to be wrapping up this video pretty soon because all we need to do is just turn our model into a codable object. And to be honest with you, I wouldn't do that, man. And the reason why is because when you're working with APIs, you don't want to tie your UI, the data that your UI is listening to directly to some kind of API response. And there's a whole bunch of reasons, but the main reason why is that, let's say for whatever reason, someone comes along and changes the entire structure of your JSON, because your model is now directly the exact same as that response. So you're using the same object. So you're using a response to save it to SwiftData. If your API was to ever change for whatever reason, you've now got to do a migration every single time. What you want to do instead is basically have some kind of object, which is basically a link between the SwiftData and the API response. So in our case, what we're actually going to do is actually fetch our data from a data source, which in our case is this JSON file, and then we're going to map that to our model and then save it. Now, in order to do this, we're going to create a new file, which is its only purpose to help us decode this file so we can map it. So it's going to be called our categories JSON decoder. File's only purpose is to basically help us handle decoding either data from an API or data from this local JSON file. So that's all this is going to do. Now I'm going to create the model to represent the JSON data, and I'm just going to call it struct category response. And it's just going to have a let of title because we don't want to be able to mutate and change this. Now, you might be wondering, why am I calling it category response if it's not an API response? Well, first of all, I'm too lazy to come up with a name right now. But second of all, as well, if you wanted to basically like add in some API stuff, you kind of got the base template here for you to work with that. So the next thing we're going to do is create a, some kind of object, which is going to help us decode this, JSON file. So I'm just going to say here, struct categories JSON decoder, and then we'll just have a static function because I don't really want to have to create an instance of this. I just want to basically just say decode it, and then we're going to say decode. So you can pretty much see here the only purpose of what this function is, and we now need to basically fetch this file locally. Well, not fetch, but get access this file locally and then decode the content. So in order to do that, we're just going to use a guard statement here. I'm just going to say let and get the URL for this file. So bundle.main URL for resource. And then this is going to find the file name that we pass in with this extension for us and give us the URL so we can access it. And then on the next line, we're then going to access it and say let content of this URL. So now we can access the data within that file. And then after here, we're then going to actually now decode that data. So we're just going to say here categories is equal to try JSON decoder dot decode, and then the type here is going to be category response dot self from this data here, and then we're just going to do an else, and then here we'll just simply return an empty array if this fails for whatever reason. What you could do is you could throw some kind of error, but we're just going to throw some kind of empty array here, and we need to mark this with also need to mark this with an optional try as well. Cool. And you can see here that we're trying to work with a JSON decoder, but the one thing I forgot to do is actually mark this category response as decodable. So you can mark it as codable if you want to, but we don't actually encode it. So there's, it's fine for it just to be decodable. But if you mark this as codable, it's not the end of the world. So now we have all this in place. So if any of these fail, we'll just return an array. And the last thing we want to do here now at the end is actually return these categories because it's now been successfully decoded. So we're going to say return categories like so. All right, boom. Sweet. All right. So now we have our categories decoder here working. We need to actually hook this up to our code, which is what we'll hook this up into our, code that we had before in our previous video where we actually pre-filled our data and reused this there. And we're going to look at that next. But if you're enjoying this video, please feel free to give this a thumbs up, and also as well comment with other videos that you want to see as well, because I do this for y'all. Now let's go into our items container from our previous video. And what we want to do in here is now, rather than us having this categories default where we were loading through the defaults for a category, we now want to replace this with our categories decoder JSON and use that within here. So let's see how we can refactor this code here. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually just store the categories in some kind of constant. So let categories is equal to our categories JSON decoder dot decode from, and the from that we're going to pass in here is the file name that we've defined here, so category defaults. So it's really important that you spell this the exact same way that you did here for this file if you've called yours something different. Now we've got these categories, and what I actually want to do is that if this is not empty, then at that point I then only want to loop through and actually inject it into the context. So we're just going to do a quick check here and say if categories is empty is equal to false. So if it's not empty, then we're going to loop through our response here, and then at this point within here, this is when we're now going to start doing the one-to-one mapping. So just so we don't forget, I'm going to actually remove this so we can actually do this fresh. And the first thing we're going to do within here is actually loop through those categories. So we're going to say categories dot for each, and then that will give us a category response. I'm just going to call it item just so it's clearer for you to see. And then here we're now going to create the mapping from our item with our model. So I'm going to say let category, which is our model here, and it accepts a title, and we're going to pass in the item title from our response into here. Cool. And then within here, we're now going to inject this new model category within the main context. So all I'm going to say here is container.mainContext.insert. And then we're going to insert this category here. Now I could have done all of this on one line, but the reason why I'm doing on multiple lines is just so it's easier for you to see. So now we pretty much have everything handled. We're decoding our JSON file locally. We're making sure that it's not empty before we actually execute any of this code. And then if it is an empty, we'll then loop through all of the categories within this file, map it to our model, and then inject it into our context. So let's run this and see what happens. So I've just got a empty, just a simulated preview here that has nothing on it. Let's run it. If I now go to my categories, you'll now see that it's actually saving them all, like it does, well, like it is in our JSON file. So this is working exactly how we expect it. And then if I was to remove one of these categories and then rerun the app, if we go to our categories again, you'll now see that it's actually not inserting it again because of the code we had in our last video where we checked to see if we should create these defaults. And this is now set to false, so we don't need to worry about that no more. Okay, sweet. So we now have a more organized way with an external file to actually help us manage pre-filling our data. So this is pretty nice and easily scalable as well. If you want to learn more about SwiftData, I actually do have a playlist on my channel. It actually covers everything you need to know about getting started with SwiftData. So I highly recommend you check that out. Also as well, if you're interested in building apps with SwiftUI, I also have a playlist as well that covers pretty much, over 90 videos of SwiftUI, getting started tutorials, all for free. So that's everything from me. I'll catch you all in a bit. Deuces.